Miss Marple and the Vanishing Postmistress. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm Edward, your host, and I'm delighted you're here tonight for another Miss Marple mystery. It's always wonderful how these timeless stories bring us together from every corner of the world. Share in the comments where you're listening from. I read and enjoy each one. Don't forget to subscribe as new mysteries arrive every single day. Now, pour yourself a warm cup of tea or coffee, get cozy, and let's step into tonight's tale. Chapter 1. Last Collection, 12:30. The snow had begun to fall just after breakfast, transforming St. Mary Mead into something quite magical. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, watching the fat white flakes settle on the garden path like powdered sugar sifted through a celestial sieve. The bare branches of the cherry tree wore delicate white sleeves, and even the most mundane objects, the garden gate, the milk bottles on the step, the weathered fence posts, had acquired an almost fairy tale quality. "Jane, my dear, you simply must come with me to the post office." Mrs. Dolly Bantry's voice carried that particular note of determination that brooked no argument. She had arrived at Danemid Cottage bundled in her best winter coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I'm quite desperate for some proper embroidery thread. That wretched stuff I bought in Much Benham last week is already coming apart, and I've half a mind to write a strongly worded letter to the manufacturer." Miss Marple smiled, setting down her cup of morning tea. "Of course, Dolly, though I suspect Mrs. Prowse will have exactly what you need. She always does." The two ladies made their way carefully along the snow-dusted lane, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The post office and stores stood at the heart of the village, its red-painted door cheerfully welcoming despite the grey sky above. The familiar red pillar box beside the entrance wore a cap of snow, and Miss Marple noticed, as she always did, the collection disc that showed the next pickup time, 12:30. Inside, the shop was pleasantly warm, filled with the mingled sense of writing paper, soap, and the particular mustiness of a place where parcels from distant locations regularly arrived. Behind the mahogany counter, polished to a warm shine, presided Mrs. Ada Prowse, a woman of perhaps 50 years, with iron grey hair swept back in a neat bun, and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything that occurred within her domain. Mrs. Prowse was efficiency personified. She moved with quick, precise gestures, whether stamping a letter, making change, or consulting the large ledger that lay open beside the brass scales. Her manner was brisk but not unkind, and she had the sort of memory that recalled exactly when Mrs. Henderson's pension was due, or whether young Tommy Baker had collected his mother's prescription. "Good morning, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," Ada said, her voice carrying the authority of one who had managed the village postal affairs for the better part of 2 decades. "Dreadful weather for December, isn't it? Though I suppose the children will be pleased." Behind the counter, a young man emerged from the sorting room carrying a stack of brown paper parcels. This was Colin Treadgold, the temporary assistant who had been helping during the busy Christmas period. He was perhaps 25, with sandy hair that perpetually fell across his forehead, and an eager-to-please manner that sometimes resulted in small mishaps. Stamps stuck together, change counted twice, packages placed on the wrong shelf. "Morning, ladies," Colin said, setting the parcels down with perhaps more care than strictly necessary. "Lovely snow, isn't it? Makes everything look so clean." The shop held its usual complement of morning customers. Miss Mabel Finch stood near the stationery display, examining the selection of writing paper with the critical eye of one who understood such matters professionally. As the village's most accomplished typist and the proprietor of a small but thriving business creating invitations and formal correspondence, Mabel had strong opinions about paper quality, ink, and the proper formation of letters. She was a thin woman of indeterminate middle age, dressed today in a dove-grey cardigan that complemented her rather pale complexion. Near the pharmaceutical section, Dr. Hardock waited with the patience of a man accustomed to delays. His weather-beaten face bore the marks of countless night calls and difficult cases, and his presence lent a certain gravity to any gathering. Today he seemed particularly preoccupied, glancing occasionally at his watch. "Expecting something important, Doctor?" Mrs. Prowse inquired, her pen poised over a form. "Laboratory results from London," he replied. "Rather urgent, actually. Should have arrived on yesterday's post." The Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife entered with a gentle jingling of the doorbell, bringing with them a swirl of cold air and snowflakes. Mrs. Clement shook the snow from her umbrella while her husband removed his hat, revealing hair that was rapidly becoming more silver than brown. "Quite a morning," the Reverend observed genially. "I do hope this snow doesn't prevent anyone from attending the Christmas Bazaar planning meeting this afternoon." Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway, his official presence creating a subtle shift in the shop's atmosphere. He was not a popular figure in St. Mary Mead. His manner was too brusque, his suspicions too readily aroused, and his tendency to jump to conclusions had created more than one uncomfortable situation in the village's recent memory. "Mrs. Prowse," he said without preamble, "I need to send an urgent wire to headquarters." "Official business?" Ada nodded crisply. "Of course, Inspector. Colin, the telegram forms are in the second drawer." The most animated customer, however, was Mrs. Emmeline Carter, a widow of comfortable means whose conversation invariably centred on her various ailments, her late husband's achievements, or her scattered family members. Today she fairly glowed with anticipation. "I'm expecting a most important delivery today," she announced to the shop at large. "A registered packet from my dear niece in London, my late brother's girl, you know. She writes that she's sending something rather special for Christmas. Something sparkly, she hinted." Mrs. Carter's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of anticipated treasure. Mrs. Prowse consulted her ledger, running her finger down a column of neat entries. "Yes, Mrs. Carter, I have a note here. Should arrive on the noon delivery from Much Benham." "How perfectly splendid! I do so love surprises, don't you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple murmured appropriate agreement while observing the small drama playing out before her. There was something particularly satisfying about watching Mrs. Prowse at work. The woman's methodical nature, her attention to detail, her unwavering adherence to proper procedures. Even now, as the morning wore on toward noon, Ada was preparing for the next mail collection with her usual precision. Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small detail that others might have missed. Through the window she could see the collection disc on the pillar box clearly. It showed 12:30, as expected for the final collection of the day. But Miss Marple knew from years of observation that Ada invariably set the disc 5 minutes early, a small personal quirk designed to encourage punctuality among the more dilatory residents of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry had found her thread and was engaged in examining several shades of blue, holding them up to the light from the window. The snow continued to fall steadily, creating an almost hypnotic pattern against the glass. As the church clock chimed the 3/4 hour, Ada Prowse tapped her ledger with the end of her pen, a gesture that seemed to signal the approaching transition from morning business to the important ritual of the noon mail collection. The familiar sounds of the shop, quiet conversation, the rustle of paper, the occasional ring of the till, created a peaceful domestic symphony. Colin appeared at Ada's shoulder, whispering something about package arrangements. She nodded, made a small notation in her ledger, and then, with the gesture that everyone in the shop had seen countless times before, she reached for the small brass bell that sat beside the scales. The clear, silvery ting-ting rang out across the shop as Ada pressed the bell twice in quick succession, her customary signal that she was stepping away from the counter for a moment. "Just popping into the sorting room," she announced cheerfully. "Shan't be a moment." And with that, Mrs. Ada Prowse disappeared behind the wooden screen that separated the public area from the working portions of the post office, leaving behind only the fading echo of the bell and the soft whisper of settling snow against the windows. None of them knew in that peaceful moment that they had just witnessed the beginning of one of the most puzzling mysteries St. Mary Mead had ever seen. Chapter 2. Counterbell Twice. The minutes ticked by with the steady rhythm of ordinary village life. Mrs. Bantry had settled upon a shade of cornflower blue that she declared would do admirably for her cushion covers, while Dr. Haydock continued his patient vigil near the pharmaceutical shelves. Miss Mabel Finch remained absorbed in her examination of writing papers, occasionally holding a sheet up to catch the light from the snow-brightened window. Miss Marple found herself studying the neat arrangement behind the counter, with the appreciation of one who understood the satisfaction of well-organised spaces. Ada Prowse's domain was a model of efficiency, stamps arranged in orderly rows, forms stacked with military precision, and the brass scales gleaming despite their obvious age and constant use. The church clock had just struck 12 when the familiar rumble of the mail van from Much Benham announced the arrival of the day's second and final delivery. Through the frosted window, Miss Marple could see the dark green vehicle pulling up beside the curb, its driver already reaching for the leather satchel that contained the afternoon's correspondence. "Right on time," Mrs. Carter observed with satisfaction. "That'll be my special delivery, I'm quite certain. My niece promised it would arrive today without fail." From behind the wooden screen came Ada's voice, clear and businesslike as always. "Just a moment, please. I'll be right with you." The shop's customers turned expectantly toward the counter, anticipating Ada's prompt reappearance. Instead, they heard the distinctive sound of the service hatch being slid across, a wooden panel that could be closed when the post office section needed to be temporarily secured. This was followed immediately by the familiar ting of the counter bell. Mrs. Bantry looked up from her thread selection. "That's odd. The bell rang, but I didn't see anyone go up to the counter." "Perhaps someone came in while we weren't looking," suggested Mrs. Clement, though her tone carried a note of uncertainty. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. She had been facing the shop entrance and was quite certain that no one had either entered or approached the counter in the past several minutes. Yet the bell had definitely sounded, that clear, unmistakable ting that occurred whenever the counter's hinge section was lifted. Colin Treadgold emerged from the sorting room, his sandy hair more dishevelled than usual. He carried a small leather pouch containing coins and moved toward the counter area with his characteristic eager efficiency. "Mrs. Prowse asked me to bring the change for the postal orders," he explained to no one in particular, then paused as he noticed the closed hatch. "That's strange. She didn't mention closing up." A minute passed, perhaps slightly longer, and then the counter bell sounded again. Another clear ting that seemed to echo more loudly in the sudden attentiveness of the shop. "There it goes again," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "But where is Mrs. Prowse?" Inspector Slack, who had been filling out his telegram form with the deliberate care of a man unaccustomed to putting official thoughts onto paper, looked up sharply. His instincts, honed by years of dealing with the unexpected and often unpleasant surprises of police work, were immediately alert. "Mrs. Prowse?" he called out in his authoritative voice. "Official business here. Need to send this wire immediately." No response came from behind the screen. Colin tried the service hatch and found it latched securely from the other side. "Mrs. Prowse?" he called, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Are you quite all right back there?" The silence that followed was of the particularly noticeable variety, the kind that seems to expand and fill a space with growing unease. Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his medical training making him sensitive to situations where someone might require assistance. "Perhaps she's taken ill," he suggested. "Colin, is there another way into the sorting room?" "Only through the back," Colin replied, his face showing the first signs of genuine alarm. "But Mrs. Prowse always keeps that door locked during business hours. Post office regulations, you know." Inspector Slack's official instincts took command of the situation. "Right then, let's have a look at this back door. Can't have the postmistress locked away when there's official business to conduct." The small group moved as one toward the rear of the shop, past the shelves of patent medicines and household supplies, to where a narrow passage led to the sorting room's entrance. The door was indeed locked, and Colin's increasingly frantic knocking produced no response whatsoever. "Stand aside, lad," Inspector Slack commanded, and with the sort of decisive action that had served him well in various official capacities, he applied his shoulder to the door with considerable force. The door gave way with a splintering crash that seemed shocking in the previously peaceful shop. Beyond lay the sorting room, neat and orderly as always, with Ada's familiar blue china graph pencil lying on her wooden stool beside the collection disc key on its length of string. But of Mrs. Ada Prowse herself there was no sign whatever. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Clement exclaimed, her hand flying to her throat. Dr. Haydock moved quickly through the sorting room to the back door that led to the small yard behind the building. This door was secured with a heavy iron bolt, drawn firmly across and showing no signs of recent disturbance. "She couldn't have gone this way," he announced. "The bolt's been drawn for hours by the look of it." Inspector Slack, his face reddening with a mixture of exertion and growing concern, forced the bolt and thrust the door open. What greeted them was a sight that would remain etched in the memory of everyone present. The small backyard lay under a pristine blanket of snow that had clearly been falling steadily for the past hour. The white surface was broken by a single set of footprints, small, neat impressions that led directly from the threshold where they now stood to the lane beyond, where they ended abruptly beside the red pillar box. But there were no returning prints, no second set of footprints belonging to another person, no wheel ruts or any other marks to suggest that a vehicle had been present. The snow told its story with crystalline clarity. Someone had walked from this door to the lane and then simply vanished. "She's been snatched!" Mrs. Carter cried out, her voice shrill with sudden terror. "Poor Mrs. Prowse has been kidnapped right from under our noses!" Mrs. Bantry's hand found Miss Marple's sleeve and gripped it tightly. The elderly detective felt the tremor in her friend's grasp, but kept her own attention focused on the details that others might overlook. The back door's threshold was edged with a delicate fringe of snow that had accumulated in the sheltered space beneath the lintel. Miss Marple noted with particular interest that this fringe was completely undisturbed along its inner edge, exactly as it would appear if the door had not been opened since the snow began to fall. "Most interesting," she murmured, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Inspector Slack was already striding across the yard, following the mysterious footprints toward their abrupt terminus at the pillar box. His heavy boots broke through the snow's surface, destroying the pristine quality that had made the single trail so clearly visible. "Blast and bother," he muttered as he examined the spot where the prints ended. "It's as if she simply flew away from here." Colin stood in the doorway, his face pale with shock and growing concern. "But this makes no sense at all. Mrs. Prowse was just here, speaking to the mail carrier. We all heard her voice. And now—" "And now she's gone," Dr. Haydock said grimly. "Vanished without a trace, it would seem." Miss Marple remained in the sorting room while the others clustered around the mysterious footprints. Her experienced eye catalogued the scene with the methodical attention that had served her so well in previous puzzling situations. The room was indeed tidy, just as it always was. The stamp safe was properly closed and locked. The money drawer showed no signs of disturbance. Even the telephone closet door in the corner remained securely shut. But something nagged at her memory. Something about those two distinct sounds of the counterbell. In her long experience of observing human behaviour, Miss Marple had learned that mechanical objects often told more reliable stories than their human counterparts. The counterbell, she knew from countless visits to this very establishment, operated on a simple hinge mechanism. It rang once when the hinged section was lifted, producing that familiar ting. But to produce two separate sounds, the hinge would need to be operated twice, which suggested two distinct actions, not the single movement of someone passing through. "Most curious indeed," she said softly to herself, her knitting needle-sharp mind already beginning to work on the puzzle that had so suddenly presented itself. Outside, the snow continued to fall with gentle persistence, as if nature itself were determined to preserve the mystery in pristine white silence. Chapter 3. Footprints to Nowhere. Inspector Slack approached the investigation of Mrs. Prowse's disappearance with the methodical determination that had served him throughout his career, though not always with the results he had hoped for. He began by establishing what he termed a proper grid system of the backyard, pacing off the small space with measured steps and examining every inch of the snow-covered ground. The footprints themselves told a story that was both clear and utterly baffling. They were undoubtedly those of a woman, Small, neat impressions made by what appeared to be sensible, low-heeled shoes of the sort that Mrs. Prowse habitually wore. The prints led in a perfectly straight line from the back door threshold to the lane, where they stopped precisely beside the red pillar box, as if their maker had simply evaporated into the cold December air. "Look at this," Slack muttered, crouching beside the final print. "Clean as you please, they are." No scuffing, no sign of a struggle. Just stops. Dr. Haydock joined him, his experienced eye examining the evidence with professional interest. "The depth is consistent throughout," he observed. "No deeper impressions that might suggest she was being dragged or forced. These are the prints of someone walking normally." "But where did she go from here?" Colin asked, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of a young man confronting something that defied all reasonable explanation. Miss Marple, who had been observing from the back doorway, stepped carefully into the yard. Her movements were precise and economical, designed to disturb as little as possible of the scene that might yet yield important information. "Inspector," she said mildly, "might I suggest that you examine the pillar box itself?" Slack looked up from his crouched position, his expression showing the familiar mixture of irritation and grudging respect that Miss Marple's suggestions invariably provoked in him. "The pillar box? What could that have to do with anything?" "Well," Miss Marple replied, "it is where the footprints end, is it not? And pillar boxes are rather substantial structures. Perhaps there might be some indication of what happened next." The inspector rose to his feet, brushing snow from his knees, and approached the pillar box with renewed attention. It was one of the older models, painted in the traditional red and bearing the royal cipher of an earlier monarch. The collection slot was at the standard height, and the entire structure appeared perfectly ordinary and undisturbed. "Nothing here," he announced after a thorough examination. "No marks, no damage, no sign that anyone's tampered with it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet the footprints stop here so very precisely, almost as if Mrs. Prowse had an appointment to keep at this exact spot." Mrs. Bantry, who had been watching the proceedings with growing anxiety, wrapped her coat more tightly around herself. "But that's impossible, Jane. People don't simply vanish into thin air, especially not in broad daylight in the middle of St. Mary Mead." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "they certainly do not." Which suggests that we may not be seeing the complete picture. Back inside the post office, the atmosphere had grown increasingly tense. The customers who had been present during Ada's disappearance milled about uncertainly, unsure whether they should remain as potential witnesses or retreat to the safety of their own homes. Miss Mabel Finch had abandoned her examination of writing papers and now stood near the counter, her pale face showing genuine concern. "This is most irregular," she murmured to Mrs. Clement. "Poor Mrs. Prowse was so very reliable. Nothing like this has ever happened before." Mrs. Carter, meanwhile, had worked herself into a state of considerable agitation. "My registered packet," she exclaimed. "What's to become of my special delivery? My niece will be most distressed if it goes astray." Inspector Slack returned from his examination of the yard, his boots leaving small puddles of melted snow on the shop floor. His expression was grim as he surveyed the assembled group. "Right then," he announced with official authority, "I'll need statements from all of you. Everything you saw, everything you heard, from the moment you entered the shop this morning." While the inspector began his interviews, Miss Marple returned to the sorting room for a more thorough examination of the scene. The room was indeed tidy, as Colin had observed, but tidiness could sometimes conceal as much as it revealed. The telephone closet in the corner drew her attention. It was a small cupboard, barely large enough for one person, containing the post office telephone equipment. The door was closed, and when she tested it gently, proved to be locked. The key was nowhere to be seen. On Ada's wooden stool lay the familiar blue china graph pencil that she used for marking packages and making notations in the various ledgers. Beside it, the collection disc key hung from its length of string, a simple but effective system that prevented the key from being misplaced. Miss Marple picked up the key and examined it closely. It was perfectly ordinary, showing the expected wear from regular use. The string was clean and showed no signs of having been tampered with or retied recently. She moved to the front of the sorting room and examined the counterbell mechanism with particular care. The bell itself was a simple brass affair, mounted on a spring that activated when the hinged section of the counter was lifted. She tested it gently, producing the familiar ting that everyone in the shop had heard twice during Mrs. Prouse's mysterious disappearance. "Most interesting," she murmured to herself. The bell's mechanism was straightforward enough. It rang once when the hinge was activated, regardless of whether the motion was up or down. To produce two separate sounds, someone would need to operate the hinge twice, two distinct movements that could not have been caused by a single person passing through the counter area. "Inspector," she called softly, and Slack looked up from his notepad where he had been recording Colin's somewhat confused account of the morning's events. "What is it now, Miss Marple? I wonder if you might test this counterbell for me. I should like to observe its operation." Slack approached the counter with his usual mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "What exactly am I looking for?" "Simply lift the hinge section and let it fall back into place, then do so again." The inspector complied, producing two clear ting sounds separated by a brief interval. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And now, Inspector, might you perform the action that a customer would normally perform, lifting the hinge to pass through to the other side, then allowing it to fall back as they complete their passage?" This time, only a single ring sounded as the hinge was lifted and naturally fell back into position during Slack's movement. "One ring for normal passage," Miss Marple observed. "Two rings for two separate actions. Yet we heard two distinct sounds, and no one was observed approaching or leaving the counter." Inspector Slack's expression showed the dawning recognition of a man beginning to understand that this case might be considerably more complex than he had initially assumed. "You're saying someone deliberately rang that bell twice?" "I'm saying the bell doesn't lie, Inspector. It operates according to simple mechanical principles. Two sounds mean two actions, regardless of what we may have thought we observed." The implications of this observation settled over the group like the snow outside. Gradually, quietly, but with an inexorable weight that changed everything about their understanding of the morning's events. Colin, who had been listening from nearby, spoke up hesitantly. "But if someone rang the bell twice on purpose, that would mean, Miss Marple finished gently, that someone wanted us to believe Mrs. Prouse had passed through the counter area twice, when in fact she may never have passed through at all." Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding to the pristine blanket that covered the mysterious footprints leading from the back door to nowhere. But inside the post office, the mechanical truth of a simple brass bell had begun to illuminate the deliberate deception that lay at the heart of Ada Prouse's impossible vanishing. Chapter 4: The Registered Packet. The revelation about the counterbell had cast the morning's events in an entirely new light, and Inspector Slack found himself approaching the investigation with considerably more caution than he had initially displayed. The idea that someone had deliberately manipulated the evidence suggested a level of premeditation that transformed Mrs. Prouse's disappearance from a simple case of possible kidnapping into something far more complex and disturbing. "Right then, Colin," the inspector said, consulting his notepad. "Let's go over this registered packet business again. You say Mrs. Prouse signed for one this morning?" Colin Treadgold nodded earnestly, his sandy hair falling across his forehead as he leaned forward. "Oh yes, Inspector. Came in with the morning delivery from Much Benham. Mrs. Prouse handled it herself, as she always does with registered items. Very particular about proper procedures is Mrs. Prouse." "And you're certain it was addressed to Mrs. Carter?" "Quite certain. I saw her stamp the oval R mark in the ledger myself. Very neat hand Mrs. Prouse has. Always uses that blue chinograph pencil for the registered entries." Mrs. Carter, who had been hovering nearby with poorly concealed anxiety, stepped forward. "Yes, that would be my packet from my dear niece. She did promise to send it registered post to ensure safe delivery. Such a thoughtful girl, always so careful about important things." Miss Marple, who had been observing this exchange with her characteristic quiet attention, moved closer to examine the registered ledger that lay open on the counter. The large leather-bound volume contained neat columns of information, dates, times, addresses, and the distinctive oval stamps that marked each registered item's arrival and disposition. "Inspector," she said mildly, "might I have a look at this morning's entries?" Slack nodded grudgingly. He had learned, through painful experience, that Miss Marple's requests usually led to discoveries that he would have preferred to make himself. The ledger fell open to the current day's page, where several entries had been recorded in Ada Prowse's familiar handwriting. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved down the columns with careful attention, taking in not just the information recorded, but the manner of its recording. "Here we are," she murmured. One registered packet addressed to Mrs. E. Carter arrived at... She paused, studying the entry more closely. "At 12 minutes past 12, according to this." "That's right," Colin confirmed, "just after the mail van arrived. I remember thinking how punctual everything was today. What with the snow and all." Miss Marple continued to examine the entry, her expression thoughtful. "And you say Mrs. Prowse stamped the oval R mark herself?" "Oh yes, definitely." Though ... Colin hesitated, his brow creasing with the effort of memory. "Though the impression does seem rather faint, doesn't it? Usually Mrs. Prowse's stamps are quite bold and clear. Indeed, the oval R mark beside Mrs. Carter's entry was noticeably lighter than the other stamps on the page, as if the person making the impression had been uncertain about the pressure required, or perhaps working with an unfamiliar stamp." "And where did Mrs. Prowse place the packet after signing for it?" Miss Marple inquired. Colin's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. "Well, that's the thing, you see. Mrs. Carter wanted to pay for the registration fee later, said she'd left her purse at home and would return this afternoon, so I think Mrs. Prowse put it in the registered drawer to await collection." The registered drawer was a secure compartment built into the counter, accessible only from behind and fitted with a substantial lock. Colin produced a key from his pocket and opened the drawer for inspection. It was empty. "That's odd," he said, his voice showing the first hints of genuine concern. "I was quite certain she put it in here." Mrs. Carter's face had grown pale. "You mean my packet is missing? Along with Mrs. Prowse?" Now, Inspector Slack said, with the sort of forced confidence that police officers adopt when situations begin to spiral beyond their immediate understanding. "Let's not jump to conclusions. There's probably a perfectly reasonable explanation." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had moved to examine the mail bag that stood ready on its trestle near the sorting room entrance. This was the outgoing mail that would be collected at 12:30 for transport back to Much Benham, and it already bore the official lead seal that marked it as ready for dispatch. "Inspector," she said quietly, "this bag appears to be prepared for collection. Did Mrs. Prowse seal it before she disappeared?" Colin looked at the bag with surprise. "She must have done. That's the proper procedure. Seal the outgoing mail before the collection time, though I don't remember seeing her do it this morning." Miss Marple examined the lead seal more closely. It bore the official Crown impression that authenticated all postal dispatches, but something about it struck her as irregular. The mark was slightly crooked, showing what appeared to be a double impression, as if the crimping tool had slipped during the sealing process. "Most interesting," she murmured. "Mrs. Prowse's seals are usually quite perfect, are they not?" "Oh, absolutely," Colin agreed. "Very particular about that sort of thing. Always says that a crooked seal reflects poorly on the entire postal service." As the group pondered these developments, Miss Mabel Finch approached the counter area with the quiet movement of someone accustomed to observing without being observed. Her professional eye, trained by years of handling correspondence and formal documents, took in the details of the scene with practiced efficiency. "Such a terrible business," she said softly, her pale fingers tracing the edge of the counter. "Poor Mrs. Prowse was always so methodical about everything. I do hope nothing dreadful has happened to her." She moved closer to the registered ledger, ostensibly to examine the morning's entries with the sort of professional interest that a typist might naturally display. "Such beautiful penmanship," she observed. "One can always admire proper script work, can't one?" Miss Marple watched Mabel's examination of the ledger with quiet interest. There was something in the younger woman's manner, a particular attention to the details of the handwriting that went beyond casual admiration. "You work with correspondence regularly, don't you, Miss Finch?" Miss Marple inquired pleasantly. "Oh yes, constantly. Invitations, formal letters, legal documents. One develops quite an eye for different hands and writing instruments. It's fascinating, really, how much you can tell about a person from their penmanship." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the telephone closet door with growing frustration, looked up from his efforts. "This door is definitely locked, and I can't find the key anywhere. It's not in any of the usual places, not on Mrs. Prowse's stool, not in any of the drawers, not hanging on any of the hooks." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the key is inside the closet itself." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Inside? But how would that be possible? One can hardly lock oneself into a closet from the inside." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not in the conventional sense. But there might be other ways to secure a door, mightn't there? Ways that would create the appearance of conventional locking while actually employing quite different methods." Inspector Slack, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with the accumulating mysteries, looked up sharply. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm merely observing that this case presents us with several seeming impossibilities," she replied calmly. "Footprints that lead nowhere, a woman who vanishes without trace, a bell that rings twice for no apparent reason, and now a locked door with a missing key. In my experience, when confronted with multiple impossibilities, one often finds that they share a common explanation, one that makes them all quite possible indeed." The snow outside continued to fall with gentle persistence, but inside the post office, the various threads of mystery were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern that, while not yet clear, was certainly becoming more complex with each passing moment. Chapter 5. 2 Gums. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to a small detail that others might have dismissed as insignificant: the condition of the stamp tray behind the counter. With the sort of methodical observation that had served her well in previous puzzling situations, she examined the various implements and materials that Mrs. Prowse used in her daily postal duties. The stamp tray contained the usual assortment of tools: sheets of stamps in various denominations, a small pair of scissors for separating perforated edges, and a pill-sized sponge that rested in a shallow depression designed for that purpose. Miss Marple touched the sponge gently with the tip of one finger. "Inspector," she said quietly, "this sponge is quite damp." Slack looked up from his notebook, where he had been recording the increasingly complex details of the case. "What's significant about that?" "Well," Miss Marple replied, "Mrs. Prowse uses gum arabic on this sponge to moisten stamps that have lost their adhesive quality. It's an old postal tradition, you know, much more reliable than water, which can damage the paper." Colin nodded earnestly. "That's right. Mrs. Prowse is very particular about proper stamp care. She always says that a stamp that won't stick properly reflects poorly on the postal service." Miss Marple examined the sponge more closely, noting the particular consistency of the moisture that clung to its surface. Gum arabic had a distinctive quality when dampened, slightly tacky, with a faint sheen that differentiated it from ordinary water. "Most interesting," she murmured, then moved her attention to the registered drawer that Colin had opened earlier. The drawer itself was empty, as they had established, but Miss Marple was more interested in the condition of its flap. She ran her finger along the edge of the wooden flap, then examined her fingertip with the sort of careful attention that might seem excessive to casual observers, but which had often proved invaluable in her previous encounters with puzzling situations. "Inspector," she said, "might you come and feel this, please?" Slack approached with his usual mixture of scepticism and reluctant cooperation. "Feel what exactly?" "The edge of this drawer flap, just here, along the rim." The inspector complied, running his thick finger along the wood where Miss Marple had indicated. His expression showed immediate recognition of something unexpected. "It's sticky," he said with surprise. "Tacky, like something's been applied to it recently." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "but not the same sort of tackiness as the gum arabic on the stamp sponge. This is different, shinier, with a different consistency entirely." Dr. Haydock, whose medical training had given him a practical knowledge of various adhesive substances, joined the examination. "It's envelope mucilage," he pronounced after a moment's investigation. "The sort of gum that's applied to envelope flaps. Quite different from stamp gum, actually. Different base, different consistency when dampened." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Someone has applied envelope gum to this drawer flap quite recently. The question is, why would anyone need to gum a drawer that was supposed to contain a registered packet?" As she continued her examination of the drawer area, something else caught her attention. A tiny fibre caught in the hinge mechanism of the flap. It was so small that it might easily have been overlooked. A delicate strand of wool in a soft dove-grey colour. "Most curious," she said, carefully extracting the fibre with her fingernail. She held it up to the light from the window, studying its colour and texture with the sort of attention that a naturalist might apply to a rare specimen. Miss Mabel Finch, who had been observing the investigation with the quiet interest of someone professionally concerned with details, stepped closer to see what Miss Marple had discovered. "Oh my," Mabel said, her pale face showing a flicker of recognition. "That looks rather like wool. Quite a lovely shade of grey, isn't it?" Miss Marple glanced at Mabel's cardigan, noting the exact match between the fibre in her hand and the soft dove-grey wool of the younger woman's garment. It was the sort of correspondence that might be purely coincidental, or might be something considerably more significant. "Such a popular colour this season," Miss Marple observed pleasantly. "Dove-grey seems to be quite fashionable among the ladies of the village." Mabel's fingers moved unconsciously to the edge of her cardigan, smoothing the wool in a gesture that might have been nervous or merely habitual. "Yes, it's a practical shade. Doesn't show dust or wear as readily as lighter colours." Colin, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion, looked from Miss Marple to the inspector. "But what does envelope gum on the drawer have to do with Mrs. Prowse's disappearance?" "That," Miss Marple replied, "is precisely what we need to determine. Someone applied envelope mucilage to this drawer flap today, and that someone was not Mrs. Prowse, who would have used her stamp gum for any adhesive purpose. The question is, who would need to seal this drawer, and why?" She paused in her examination to consider the implications. "You mentioned earlier, Colin, that Mrs. Prowse put the registered packet in this drawer to await Mrs. Carter's return with payment, but the packet has vanished, and the drawer shows signs of having been sealed with envelope gum rather than simply closed." Inspector Slack was beginning to show signs of the sort of methodical thinking that occasionally served him well in complex cases. "You're suggesting someone deliberately sealed something into this drawer?" "Or," Miss Marple said gently, "someone wanted to ensure that the drawer remained closed long enough for other arrangements to be made. Envelope mucilage, when applied to wood and allowed to dry slightly, creates a temporary but quite effective seal." Mrs. Carter, who had been growing increasingly agitated about the fate of her special delivery, stepped forward. "But this is all very well. But what's become of my registered packet? My niece will be most distressed if it's gone astray." Miss Marple turned her attention to Mrs. Carter with the sort of gentle focus that had often prompted important revelations in previous cases. "Tell me, Mrs. Carter, exactly what did your niece's letter say about this packet? Her exact words, if you can recall them." Mrs. Carter's face brightened at the opportunity to discuss correspondence from her beloved niece. "Oh, she was quite mysterious about it, actually. Said she was sending something sparkly for Christmas, something that would arrive by registered post, and that I should be very careful about it because it was rather valuable. And she specified that it would arrive today. Well, not exactly today. She said it would arrive soon, and that I should watch for it. When I heard about registered deliveries this morning, I naturally assumed—" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The distinction between assumption and certainty had often proved crucial in her experience with puzzling situations. "Inspector," she said, "I believe we may need to examine that outgoing mail bag rather more carefully. The one with the crooked seal." As the snow continued to fall outside, transforming St. Mary Mead into an increasingly ethereal landscape, the small group gathered around the mailbag began to understand that they were dealing with something considerably more complex than a simple disappearance. The evidence of 2 different types of gum, the mysterious wool fibre, and the peculiar sealing of the registered drawer suggested a level of planning and deception that cast the entire morning's events in a new and troubling light. Chapter 6, Lead Seal, Wrong Bite. Inspector Slack approached the mailbag with the sort of official determination that he reserved for moments when he sensed that important evidence might be at hand. The bag itself was a standard postal sack made of heavy canvas and designed to withstand the rigours of transport between post offices. What interested Miss Marple, however, was not the bag itself, but the lead seal that secured its opening. "Inspector," she said quietly, "before you examine the contents, might we look more closely at this seal?" Slack paused in his preparations to open the bag, his hands already positioned to cut through the lead strip that held it closed. "What about it?" "Looks like a perfectly ordinary postal seal to me." Miss Marple moved closer, her pale blue eyes taking in the details of the small lead disc that bore the official crown impression. "Yes, it does bear the proper marking. But notice how it's been applied." The seal was indeed slightly crooked, as she had observed earlier, but closer examination revealed something even more significant. The crown impression showed a double mark, as if the crimping tool had been applied twice or had slipped during the sealing process. "That's odd," Colin observed, leaning in to see what had caught Miss Marple's attention. "Mrs. Prowse's seals are always perfectly straight. She's very proud of that, actually. Says it's a matter of professional standard." Dr. Haydock, whose practical experience with various tools and implements served him well in such observations, studied the seal with professional interest. "This shows definite signs of a double bite. See here, how the crown impression overlaps itself slightly. That would happen if the crimping tool slipped, or if someone unfamiliar with the proper technique attempted to use it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, and Mrs. Prowse, with her years of experience, would certainly not make such an error, which suggests that someone else applied this seal. Inspector Slack's expression showed the dawning recognition of someone beginning to understand the full complexity of the situation before him. "You're saying someone else sealed this bag? But who would have access to the official crimping tool?" "An excellent question, Inspector. Perhaps we might examine the contents before drawing any conclusions." Slack produced his penknife and carefully cut through the lead seal, taking care not to disturb the knot that secured the bag's opening. As the heavy canvas fell open, the expected contents were revealed: letters, packages, and various postal items ready for transport to Much Benham. But at the bottom of the bag, Miss Marple's sharp eyes detected something that should not have been there. "Inspector," she said, "might you remove that cardboard cylinder near the bottom?" Slack reached into the bag and withdrew a flattened tube of cardboard, perhaps 6 inches in length, and showing signs of having been compressed by the weight of the mail above it. The cylinder had a faint but distinctive scent that Miss Marple recognised immediately. "Lavender," she murmured, "or rather, lavender-scented adhesive, the sort used in certain types of commercial applications." Attached to the cylinder was a length of string tied with a knot that drew Dr. Haydock's immediate attention. "That's a left-handed knot," he observed. "Quite distinctive, actually. Left-handed people tie knots differently than right-handed ones. The final twist goes the opposite direction." Colin examined the string and knot with growing puzzlement. But what would a cardboard tube be doing in the outgoing mail? And why would it smell of lavender? Miss Marple turned the cylinder over in her hands, noting its construction and the particular way it had been flattened. "This appears to be a mailing tube, the sort used to protect documents during postal transport. But it's been emptied and compressed, as if its original contents had been removed and something else substituted." "A redirection slip, perhaps," she mused aloud. "Such slips are often rolled and placed in protective tubes when being sent between post offices." The implications of this discovery settled over the group with the weight of accumulating evidence. Someone had placed an empty, lavender-scented tube in the outgoing mail bag, sealed with an improperly applied lead seal that showed signs of inexpert handling. Dr. Haydock, who had been called away earlier but had remained to observe the unfolding investigation, looked at his watch with growing concern. I hate to interrupt this fascinating detective work, but if Mrs. Prowse has indeed been taken against her will, time may be of considerable importance. Each hour that passes reduces the likelihood of... He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear to everyone present. Inspector Slack, galvanized by this reminder of the potentially serious nature of their situation, moved to the telephone. "I'll wire Much Benham immediately. If there was suspicious motor traffic on the roads this morning, someone will have noticed." While the inspector composed his urgent message, Miss Marple continued to examine the evidence they had gathered. The crooked lead seal with its double bite, the cardboard tube with its lavender scent and left-handed knot, the envelope mucilage on the registered drawer, and the dove-grey wool fibre all painted a picture of deliberate deception, carried out by someone with access to the post office, but lacking Mrs. Prowse's professional expertise. Miss Mabel Finch, who had been observing the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone professionally interested in detail and precision, approached the counter where the various pieces of evidence had been arranged. "Such a puzzling business," she said softly. "One would think that postal procedures, being so well established and routine, would be difficult to manipulate. But I suppose anyone with sufficient knowledge of the system might find ways to work around the usual safeguards." Miss Marple looked up from her examination of the cardboard tube. "You speak as someone with considerable knowledge of postal procedures yourself, Miss Finch." Mabel's pale face showed a slight flush. "Well, in my line of work, one does become familiar with various mailing requirements, registered post, redirection forms, proper addressing procedures. It's all quite fascinating, really, from a professional standpoint." The mention of redirection forms caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. Such forms were specialised postal documents, not commonly known to the general public, yet Miss Finch had mentioned them with the casual familiarity of someone well versed in their use. "Redirection forms," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, those would be quite useful to someone wishing to redirect registered mail, wouldn't they?" Outside, the snow had begun to fall more heavily, creating an increasingly thick blanket over the mysterious footprints that led from the post office to nowhere. But inside, the various threads of evidence were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern that suggested not kidnapping or violence, but something far more subtle and carefully planned, a deception designed to hide the theft of registered mail through the manipulation of the very postal system that was meant to protect it. Chapter 7, Form P, Redirect. The afternoon brought with it an unexpected visitor in the person of Mr. Simmons, the village solicitor, whose arrival at the post office was heralded by the careful stamping of snow from his boots and the methodical shaking of his umbrella. Mr. Simmons was a man of precise habits and measured speech, qualities that had served him well in his legal practice, and made him a repository of useful information about the more formal aspects of village life. "Inspector Slack," he said, moving his hat and revealing hair that was carefully combed despite the weather. "I understand there's been some difficulty here. Most irregular business, I'm told." "That's putting it mildly, Mr. Simmons," the inspector replied. "Mrs. Prowse has vanished without a trace, and we're dealing with what appears to be a rather complex situation involving registered mail." Mr. Simmons nodded gravely, his legal mind immediately grasping the potential implications. "Yes, quite serious indeed. Interference with His Majesty's mail is a federal matter, you know. But I may have information that bears upon your investigation." He reached into his leather document case and withdrew a familiar-looking form, printed on official postal stationery. "This came to my attention yesterday afternoon. A temporary redirection request for registered mail, General Post Office Form P7 to be precise." Miss Marple's attention sharpened immediately. The mention of redirection forms confirmed her growing suspicion that this case involved not random violence, but careful manipulation of postal procedures. "The form was filed by 1E. Carter," Mr. Simmons continued, consulting his notes, "requesting that all registered mail addressed to Mrs. Emmeline Carter be temporarily redirected to Post Office Box 17, Much Benham, for a period of 1 month." Mrs. Carter, who had been hovering nearby in a state of increasing anxiety about her missing packet, stepped forward with evident surprise. "But I filed no such form. I would certainly remember requesting such a thing." Mr. Simmons examined the document more closely, his practised eye taking in the details of its preparation. "The form appears to be properly completed and bears what purports to be your signature, Mrs. Carter. However, there are certain irregularities that caught my attention." He held the form up to the light, pointing to specific details. "The typing, for instance. Notice how the letter E in the surname Carter sits slightly higher than the other letters. It's a characteristic that suggests the use of a typewriter with a misaligned key." Miss Marple moved closer to examine the form, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of its construction and execution. "Most interesting, Mr. Simmons. And you say this was filed yesterday?" "Indeed. Brought to my office at approximately 5 o'clock by young Colin here, who claimed to be acting on Mrs. Prowse's instructions." Colin Treadgold's face flushed crimson as all eyes turned toward him. That's correct," he stammered. "Mrs. Prowse asked me to take it to Mr. Simmons for filing. Said it was urgent postal business." Inspector Slack's expression had grown increasingly stern. "And you didn't think to mention this earlier when we were discussing the missing registered packet?" I didn't think it was connected," Colin replied weakly. "It seemed like routine paperwork." Miss Marple studied the young man's face with the sort of gentle attention that had often prompted important confessions in her previous encounters with deceptive situations. "Colin, dear, are you quite certain that Mrs. Prowse personally gave you this form to file?" Colin's discomfort was evident as he shifted from foot to foot. "Well, that is, I understood from her that—" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested kindly, "it would be easier if you simply told us exactly what happened, without trying to interpret anyone's intentions." Under this gentle but persistent questioning, Colin's story began to emerge in fragments. The redirection form had indeed been brought to him yesterday afternoon, but not directly by Mrs. Prowse. Instead, it had been given to him by Miss Mabel Finch, who had explained that Mrs. Prowse was too busy with end-of-day procedures to handle the matter herself. "Miss Finch said Mrs. Prowse had asked her to arrange it," Colin explained, his voice growing smaller with each word. "She said it was a favour for Mrs. Carter, who needed her registered mail sent to a different address temporarily." Inspector Slack turned his attention to Miss Mabel Finch, who had grown noticeably pale during Colin's recitation. "Is this true, Miss Finch? Did you prepare this redirection form?" Mabel's hands twisted nervously at the edge of her dove-grey cardigan. Yes, I typed the form, but only as a favour. Mrs. Carter asked me to help her with the paperwork because she wasn't familiar with the proper procedures." "But I did no such thing," Mrs. Carter protested indignantly. "I never requested any redirection of my mail, and I certainly didn't ask you to prepare any forms on my behalf." The contradiction hung in the air like the snow that continued to fall outside, creating a silence that seemed to expand until it filled the entire post office. Miss Marple broke the silence with a question that seemed almost casual. "Miss Finch, you mentioned Post Office Box 17 in Much Benham. That's rather specific, isn't it? Do you happen to be familiar with that particular box?" Mabel's flush deepened. It's a box I rent for my business correspondence. Sometimes clients prefer to have material sent there for convenience." "I see," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "So registered mail redirected to that box would come directly into your hands." The implications of this revelation settled over the group with increasing weight. The redirection form, typed on a machine with a characteristic misaligned E, had been prepared by someone with access to Post Office Box 17, filed by someone who claimed to be acting on official instructions, and designed to send Mrs. Carter's registered packet to a location controlled by Miss Mabel Finch. Mr. Simmons, whose legal training had given him considerable experience with fraudulent documents, examined the form once more. "Inspector, I believe you'll find that the signature purporting to be Mrs. Carter's is also suspect. The pen pressure and letter formation are inconsistent with genuine signatures I've seen from Mrs. Carter in other contexts. Dr. Haydock, who had remained largely silent during these revelations, spoke up with the authority of his medical knowledge. Forgery of official documents is a serious matter, particularly when it involves postal fraud. The penalties can be quite severe. Miss Mabel Finch seemed to shrink into herself as the weight of evidence accumulated around her. Her dove-grey cardigan, which had seemed so innocuous earlier in the day, now appeared to carry with it the memory of wool fibres found in suspicious places and the suggestion of hands that had worked with the envelope gum and misaligned typewriter keys. Outside, the snow continued its relentless fall, covering the village in pristine white that masked the complexity of human deception beneath. But inside the post office, the various threads of fraud, forgery, and carefully planned theft were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern that would soon reveal the full scope of the crime that had been perpetrated under the cover of a seemingly impossible disappearance. Chapter 8. Midnight at the Pillar Box. The accumulation of evidence against Miss Mabel Finch had created a compelling case for postal fraud, but Inspector Slack remained troubled by one fundamental question that gnawed at his methodical police mind. The physical impossibility of Mrs. Prowse's disappearance, those footprints leading from the back door to nowhere, still defied reasonable explanation, even with the growing understanding of the deception surrounding the registered packet. "It's all very well to establish motive and method for the theft," he said to Miss Marple as the afternoon light began to fade. "But we still haven't found Mrs. Prowse herself, and those footprints remain as mysterious as ever." Miss Marple, who had been quietly considering this very problem, looked up from her examination of the various pieces of evidence they had gathered. "Inspector, I wonder if you might be willing to attempt a small experiment this evening? I believe a practical demonstration might illuminate certain aspects of this case that have remained obscure." Slack's expression showed the familiar mixture of scepticism and grudging respect that Miss Marple's suggestions invariably provoked. "What sort of experiment?" "A reconstruction of this morning's events, carried out at the same time but with proper visibility. I suspect that what appeared impossible in broad daylight might prove to be quite achievable under different circumstances." The inspector considered this proposal with the sort of methodical thinking that occasionally served him well in complex cases. "You're suggesting we come back here at midnight?" "Indeed, with fresh snow falling to provide the proper conditions and Sergeant Lake to assist with the technical aspects of the demonstration." By 11:30 that evening a small group had assembled at the post office. The snow was falling more heavily than it had during the morning, creating the sort of pristine conditions that Miss Marple felt would be necessary for a proper test of her theory. Inspector Slack had brought Sergeant Lake, a competent officer whose practical skills often proved valuable in unusual situations. The village lay under a thick blanket of white, and the post office stood silent and somewhat eerie in the moonlight that filtered through the falling snow. The red pillar box, now crowned with a substantial cap of snow, stood sentinel beside the building like a mute witness to the morning's mysteries. "Right then, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said, stamping his feet against the cold. "What exactly are we meant to be demonstrating?" Miss Marple, bundled warmly in her winter coat and carrying a small electric torch, moved to the back door of the post office. "First, Inspector, I should like you to observe the counterbell mechanism from inside while Sergeant Lake operates the back door." They entered through the front, using the key that Colin had provided, and positioned themselves where they could observe both the counter area and the sorting room. Sergeant Lake went to the back door and, following Miss Marple's instructions, opened it from the inside. The result was immediately instructive. As the door swung open, snow that had accumulated against its outer edge fell inward, scattering across the threshold in a distinctive pattern. More significantly, the counterbell remained completely silent. "Now," Miss Marple said, "please have the sergeant close the door and attempt to operate the front counter hatch." Lake moved to the front of the building and, reaching through the public entrance, lifted the hinged section of the counter. The familiar ting rang out clearly in the still night air. "The counterbell operates only when the front hatch is moved," Miss Marple observed. "It has no connection whatever to the back door, which means that the two sounds we heard this morning, both rings of the counterbell, were produced by someone manipulating the front hatch, not by anyone actually passing through to the back. Inspector Slack's expression showed the dawning comprehension of someone beginning to understand a cleverly constructed deception. "You're saying the bell sounds were deliberately created to make us think Mrs. Prowse had gone into the back room?" "Precisely. Someone wanted to establish the impression that she had passed through to the sorting room and then out the back door, when in fact she may never have left the front portion of the building at all." Miss Marple moved to examine the telephone closet, that small cupboard in the corner of the sorting room that had remained locked throughout their investigation. "Sergeant Lake, might you bring your tools? I believe we need to examine this closet more carefully." Lake produced a small set of implements designed for dealing with locks and mechanical devices. But before he could begin working on the conventional lock, Miss Marple stopped him. "First, Sergeant, please examine the keyhole itself. Look closely at its edges." Lake directed his torch beam at the keyhole and immediately noticed something unusual. "There's a piece of string threaded through it, Miss Marple. Thin string, barely visible." Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. "And if you follow that string, where does it lead?" The sergeant traced the nearly invisible thread and discovered that it formed a small loop on the inside of the closet door, a loop that, when pulled tight from the outside, would effectively lock the door without requiring a key. "Someone's created a makeshift lock," Lake reported. "Quite ingenious, actually. Pull the string tight from the outside and the door can't be opened from within." "And the knot that secures the string?" Miss Marple inquired. Lake examined the fastening more closely. "Left-handed knot, just like the one on that cardboard tube we found in the mail bag." The implications of this discovery were immediately clear to everyone present. Someone had locked the telephone closet using a string loop threaded through the keyhole, a method that would leave the door apparently locked with the key missing, while actually allowing the person who had created the lock to release it at will by cutting or loosening the string. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe we should open this closet." Sergeant Lake cut the string and the door swung open immediately to reveal a cramped but occupied space. Mrs. Ada Prowse sat huddled in the corner, her hands bound and a gag in her mouth that had clearly been fashioned from cloth treated with some aromatic substance that still carried a faint scent of lavender. She was alive, though clearly dazed and frightened by her ordeal. Dr. Haydock, who had joined the midnight expedition, immediately began examining her condition, while Inspector Slack carefully removed her restraints. "Lavender," Dr. Haydock observed as he examined the gag. "The same scent we detected on that cardboard tube. Some sort of adhesive preparation, I'd say." As Mrs. Prowse recovered her composure, the full scope of the deception became clear. She had been lured into the telephone closet by someone claiming to need assistance with postal equipment, then quickly overpowered and secured with a string lock before she could raise an alarm. But one mystery remained. Miss Marple moved to the pillar box outside, where the morning's footprints were now covered by fresh snow. Using her torch, she examined the collection chute carefully. Caught in the metal edges of the slot, barely visible even with direct illumination, was a tiny pill of grey wool, exactly the dove-grey shade of Miss Mabel Finch's cardigan. "The footprints," Miss Marple said with quiet satisfaction, "were made after Mrs. Prowse was already secured in the closet. Someone walked deliberately from the back door to this pillar box, leaving a trail designed to suggest that she had escaped this way. But the real purpose was to plant evidence, this wool fibre, that would be discovered during the investigation. The midnight demonstration had revealed the full scope of the deception, a carefully planned theft disguised as an impossible disappearance, executed by someone with detailed knowledge of postal procedures and access to the tools and materials necessary to manipulate both the evidence and the investigation itself. Chapter 9. Wrong Hand, Wrong Ink. The discovery of Mrs. Prowse alive, though shaken by her ordeal, had transformed the investigation from a potential case of kidnapping into one of elaborate fraud and assault. As dawn broke over St. Mary Mead, Inspector Slack found himself with a living victim who could provide testimony, a collection of physical evidence that painted a clear picture of deception and a growing certainty about the identity of the perpetrator. Mrs. Prowse, after receiving medical attention from Dr. Haydock and a restorative cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry, was able to provide her account of the morning's events with the precision that characterised all her professional endeavours. "I was preparing the noon collection as usual," she explained, her voice still slightly hoarse from the gag but her manner as methodical as ever. "Miss Finch approached me just before 12, saying she had a question about a new type of rubber stamp she was considering for her business. She asked if I might step into the telephone closet to examine some samples she had brought." Miss Marple listened to this account with particular attention to the details that revealed the careful planning behind the assault. "And once you were in the closet, Mrs. Prowse?" "She pushed me inside quite forcefully and somehow secured the door. I heard her moving about in the sorting room for several minutes, drawers opening, papers rustling, that sort of thing. Then everything went quiet for a considerable time." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook, where he had been recording the various pieces of evidence they had accumulated. "Mrs. Prowse, during the time Miss Finch was active in the sorting room, do you recall hearing the counterbell?" "Oh yes, distinctly. It rang twice, though I couldn't understand why. I called out, thinking perhaps a customer needed assistance, but of course no one could hear me from inside that cramped closet." This confirmation of the deliberate manipulation of the counterbell added another piece to the puzzle that was now nearly complete. Miss Marple turned her attention to the registered ledger, examining once again the entry that had been made for Mrs. Carter's packet. In the morning light, certain details that had seemed merely curious now appeared clearly significant. The entry was indeed made in Ada's characteristic neat handwriting, but closer examination revealed subtle differences that spoke of careful imitation rather than natural execution. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, pointing to the ledger entry, "notice the ink used for this registered entry. It's black ink, applied with a steel nib." Mrs. Prowse looked at the entry with professional interest. "That's quite wrong, actually. I always use my blue chinograph pencil for marking registered times in the ledger. It's my invariable habit. Blue for registered entries, black ink only for regular correspondence notations." Dr. Haydock, whose medical training had given him considerable experience with different writing implements, examined the entry more closely. The pressure and flow characteristics are definitely those of a steel pen nib, not a pencil, and the ink has that particular stiffness that comes from someone working carefully to imitate another's handwriting rather than writing naturally. Miss Marple moved to examine the collection disc that still showed 12:30 on the pillar box outside. "Mrs. Prowse, what time do you customarily set this disc for the final collection?" "Oh, always 5 minutes early," Ada replied promptly. 12:25 for a 12:30 collection. It's a little trick I learned years ago to encourage punctuality among the more dawdling residents of the village. Yet today it shows exactly 12:30, the official time, not your customary early setting. The significance of this detail was immediately apparent to everyone present. Someone unfamiliar with Mrs. Prowse's long-established habit had set the disc according to official procedures rather than personal practice, revealing their lack of intimate knowledge of her working methods. Inspector Slack had been examining the lead seal from the mailbag with renewed attention, comparing it to other seals that Mrs. Prowse had applied to previous dispatches. "Mrs. Prowse, this seal shows what we're calling a double bite, as if the crimping tool had been applied twice or had slipped during use." Ada examined the seal with the sort of professional disapproval that such shoddy work naturally provoked. "Absolutely dreadful technique. I pride myself on clean, straight seals. This looks like the work of someone using a domestic crimper rather than the proper postal tool." Miss Marple's attention was caught by this observation. "A domestic crimper, Mrs. Prowse?" "The sort of device used for embossing ribbons or sealing invitations. Similar principle to the postal crimper, but not designed for lead seals. The pressure distribution is different, which would account for that double impression." The mention of ribbon embossing and invitation sealing immediately brought to mind Miss Mabel Finch's business, which regularly involved such decorative work. Inspector Slack made a note to examine Mabel's shop for evidence of such equipment. Colin Treadgold, who had remained largely silent during these revelations, finally spoke up with the sort of guilty confession that had been building throughout the investigation. "I'm afraid I must tell you something about yesterday evening, Inspector. After I delivered that redirection form to Mr. Simmons, Miss Finch asked me to help her practice filling out postal forms." "Practice?" Miss Marple inquired gently. She said she wanted to be certain she understood the proper procedures, in case other clients needed similar assistance. We filled out several practice forms, and she asked me to burn them afterward to avoid confusion with the real documents. This revelation provided the final piece of evidence for premeditation. Miss Finch had not only prepared the fraudulent redirection form, but had practiced the procedures necessary to carry out her deception, ensuring that she would be able to execute the theft without making obvious errors. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the various knots found throughout the case, on the cardboard tube, the string lock, and Mrs. Prowse's restraints, made an observation that tied together several threads of evidence. All of these knots are tied left-handed. The final twist consistently goes in the direction characteristic of left-handed individuals. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Miss Finch is indeed left-handed. I observed her writing yesterday, and her pen grip and hand position were quite characteristic." The accumulation of evidence had reached the point where individual details began to reinforce each other, creating a comprehensive picture of careful planning, deliberate deception, and methodical execution. The wrong ink in the ledger, the improperly set collection disc, the domestically crimped seal, the left-handed knots, and the practiced preparation of fraudulent forms all pointed to a single perpetrator who had access, opportunity, and detailed knowledge of postal procedures. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with the satisfaction of a man who had finally assembled all the pieces of a complex puzzle. "I believe, Miss Marple, that we have sufficient evidence to make an arrest. The case against Miss Mabel Finch appears to be quite complete." Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the winter sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the village that had been transformed overnight from a scene of mystery into one where truth had finally emerged from beneath the pristine white surface of carefully constructed deception. Chapter 10. The Vanishing Explained. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall presented a scene that had become familiar to the residents of St. Mary Mead over the years. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the comfortable chair by the fire, surrounded by the principal figures in yet another puzzling case that had disrupted the peaceful routine of village life. Mrs. Bantry had arranged the gathering with her usual efficiency, ensuring that everyone who had played a role in the morning's mysterious events was present to hear the complete explanation. Colonel Bantry occupied his favourite chair near the window, while Dr. Haydock had positioned himself where he could observe both Miss Marple and the assembled group. The Reverend and Mrs. Clement sat together on the sofa, their expressions showing the sort of concerned attention that the morning's events naturally warranted. Mr. Simmons had brought his legal documents, arranged with characteristic precision on the side table, and Inspector Slack stood near the fireplace with his notebook ready, though his expression suggested a man who'd already reached his own conclusions about the case. Colin Treadgold sat somewhat apart from the others, his face showing the guilty discomfort of someone who had unwittingly assisted in criminal activity. Miss Mabel Finch occupied a chair near the door, her dove-grey cardigan wrapped tightly around her thin frame, her pale face showing alternating flashes of defiance and resignation. Mrs. Prowse, recovered from her ordeal but still bearing the signs of her frightening experience, sat with the sort of dignified composure that had characterized her professional demeanour for so many years. Her presence as a living witness had transformed what might have been a case of mysterious disappearance into one of proven assault and fraud. Miss Marple began her explanation with the gentle manner that had served her so well in previous cases, her pale blue eyes taking in each member of the assembled group with quiet attention. "The mystery that confronted us this morning," she said, "appeared to centre upon the impossible vanishing of Mrs. Prowse from a locked room, leaving behind only a set of footprints that led to nowhere. However, as so often happens in cases that seem to defy natural law, the impossibility proved to be carefully constructed rather than genuinely supernatural." She paused to arrange her knitting, a gesture that had become as familiar to the village as her remarkable ability to unravel the most complex deceptions. The motive for this elaborate scheme was quite straightforward. Miss Finch had learned, through her professional connection with Mrs. Carter's correspondence needs, that a valuable registered packet was expected. She had also discovered that Mrs. Carter was somewhat casual about collecting her mail promptly, which presented an opportunity for temporary theft. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. The redirection form, you mean? Precisely. Miss Finch prepared a fraudulent Form P7 using her own typewriter, the one with the characteristic misaligned E that appears on all her business correspondence. She forged Mrs. Carter's signature and arranged for the registered mail to be redirected to Post Office Box 17 in Much Benham, a box she controlled for her business purposes. Mrs. Carter's face showed the indignation of someone whose trust had been systematically betrayed. But how could she be certain the packet would arrive when she planned? Miss Marple's expression remained gentle but firm. She couldn't, Mrs. Carter, which is why she needed Mrs. Prowse out of the way for an extended period, not just for a specific delivery. The redirection form would ensure that your packet, whenever it arrived, would be sent to her box rather than remaining in the local post office. She turned her attention to the method by which the deception had been carried out. Yesterday afternoon, Miss Finch had Colin file the redirection form, claiming to act on Mrs. Prowse's authority. This established the legal basis for diverting the registered mail. Today, she needed to ensure that Mrs. Prowse would not be present to question the handling of Mrs. Carter's packet. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. The assault in the telephone closet? Indeed. Miss Finch approached Mrs. Prowse with a pretext about examining rubber stamps, a subject that would naturally interest a professional typist. Once Mrs. Prowse was inside the cramped closet, Miss Finch overpowered her, bound and gagged her with materials prepared in advance, and secured the door using the ingenious string lock that we discovered. She demonstrated the mechanism with a length of yarn from her knitting bag. A simple loop threaded through the keyhole and pulled tight from the outside creates an effective lock that appears conventional but requires no key. The knots, as Dr. Haydock observed, were tied left-handed, Miss Finch's dominant hand. Colin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but the counterbell rang twice. We all heard it. Yes, and that was a crucial element of the deception. Miss Finch deliberately operated the counterhatch twice to create the impression that Mrs. Prowse had passed through to the sorting room and then continued to the backyard. In reality, Mrs. Prowse never left the telephone closet. Miss Marple moved to the heart of the deception, the manipulation of the postal records and procedures. While Mrs. Prowse was secured in the closet, Miss Finch had access to the sorting room and the registered ledger. She made a false entry recording the arrival of Mrs. Carter's packet, using black ink instead of Mrs. Prowse's customary blue chinograph pencil, a detail that revealed the forgery to careful observation. She held up the registered drawer flap, where traces of envelope mucilage were still visible. Miss Finch sealed the registered drawer with envelope gum to prevent anyone from discovering that no packet had actually been placed inside. She then prepared the outgoing mail bag, placing the empty cardboard tube inside, a tube that had contained the rolled redirection form, and sealed the bag with her domestic crimper rather than the proper postal tool. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. The double bite on the lead seal? Exactly. Miss Finch's experience was with ribbon embossing and invitation sealing, not postal procedures. Her technique betrayed her amateur status despite her careful planning. The final element of the deception involved the mysterious footprints that had so puzzled everyone that morning. After securing Mrs. Prowse and manipulating the postal records, Miss Finch left through the front entrance like any ordinary customer. Later, when the snow had begun to fall more heavily, she returned and deliberately created the footprints from the back door to the pillar box. This served two purposes. It suggested that Mrs. Prowse had escaped through the backyard, and it allowed Miss Finch to plant the wool fibre from her cardigan in the pillar box chute, creating false evidence that would implicate her in the escape, while actually misdirecting suspicion from the real crime. The room fell silent as the implications of this complete explanation settled over the assembled group. The vanishing that had seemed so mysterious was revealed as an elaborate combination of assault, forgery, postal fraud, and evidence manipulation, carried out by someone with detailed knowledge of both postal procedures and the personal habits of everyone involved. Miss Mabel Finch finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never intended any real harm to Mrs. Prowse. I thought I could simply hold the packet until after Christmas and then find a way to return it without anyone knowing." Miss Marple's response was kind but uncompromising. "Letters and packages do not belong to those who can type the fastest or forge the most convincing signatures, my dear. They belong where proper procedures and honest habits place them, protected by the law that governs His Majesty's mail." Inspector Slack stepped forward with official authority. "Mabel Finch, you're under arrest for postal theft, forgery of official documents and assault. Colin Treadgold, you will be charged as an accessory, though your cooperation may be considered in determining your sentence." As the legal proceedings began and the various participants prepared to leave Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry brought Mrs. Prowse a fresh cup of tea and settled beside her with motherly concern. "Vanished postmistresses," she said with a slight shudder, "oughtn't to be a thing in civilized places like St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the gentle smile that had become as much a part of village life as the church bells or the morning mail delivery. "They rarely are, Mrs. Bantry. Usually it's only a habit that has gone missing, until someone notices which particular habit has been broken and why." Outside, the winter sun had emerged fully, transforming the snow-covered village into a scene of sparkling beauty that seemed to celebrate the restoration of truth and order to the peaceful world of St. Mary Mead.